first thing you need to consider or think about when you're going to use fire with the livestock management is having a native plant community. Native rangeland, native woodlands, whatever, and we call that basically native rangeland. All of that is combined in what we call native plants. So if you have introduced forages, such as what we're standing on here, like Bermuda grass, fire is probably not what you need to consider, really, because you probably have fertilized it, you've probably used herbicides or whatever to control competition from weeds or forbs, broadleaf plants that we call them. So if you've got that money invested in it, then you ought to be eating it with cows and have that all worked out rather than looking at trying to burn it. So that's kind of that's one of the big picture type things. And then secondarily, you know, cat's already out of the bag, so you already know. Or did we get to that before they stopped us? Did we get to the primary question? I think we did.
We're just getting there.
Okay, we're just getting there.
Yeah.
If you have cattle and you want to implement fire, then and you know you have native plant communities, what's your first issue you got to address? What's that?
Where are the cattle?
Where are the cattle? Yeah. So, you know, and I think we talked about grazing management or overgrazing. Somebody said so. That's right. You need to address carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is basically, you know, the number of animals of whatever kind you have that a rangeland or a particular piece of ground can support. And that'll vary throughout your property. You know, your soil types aren't all the same. It's not a monoculture of soil. So therefore you're not going to have a monoculture of plants on your property. You're going to have different areas that'll be comprised of different plant communities. So therefore they're going to produce different amounts of forage. And however much forage that those sites produce in a really good rainfall year and if they're at the upper end of secondary plant succession, then that's the amount of forage that those sites are going to produce from now on. In other words, there's a finite amount of production that each soil type and each associated plant community can produce. It's not going to, you can't make lemonade out of lemons in this instance. You're limited. But you can advance that to some extent depending on composition, that kind of stuff, which is a whole different story. So, so you have a finite amount of forage production on a property, and so what we like to do is look at what that might be and look at that on good years of rainfall as well as poor years of rainfall. And then we like to split the middle. And split in the middle is where we want to establish our carrying capacity. Why do we want to do that? Got to have leftover forage to burn, right? Yeah, that's one primary consideration if we're going to use fire is to be able to have the fuel to be able to burn. If we eat it all with our cows, we can't implement a prescribed burn program, right? So the other benefits to that is that, you know, how many years do we get good rainfall? Don't get it every year, do we? So we have drought to mitigate. So if we're stocked moderately or even lightly, that gives us two big advantages. The biggest advantage probably is mitigating drought concerns. So whenever everybody else that's overstocked don't get rain, and their pastures look like this, they don't have any grass. If you're stocked moderate to light, you still got grass out there. You're not going to probably burn it that year, being dry. But then when you do get some good years of rainfall, then you've got a fuel accumulation, a grass accumulation that you can go out and burn. And so you can set those aside either by having pastures or paddocks. You're dividing your place up into pastures, and so you can set a pasture aside. You know what kind of rainfall that you might be getting, so you can adjust your grazing or where you're moving cattle to where you can allow time for that grass to grow to build up fuel to be able to burn. So we like to recommend a minimum of 1,500 pounds of fuel or fine fuel. These grasses are classified as fine fuel. That's what we call it. They're called, or technical terms, 1-hour fuels. That means that in 1 hour's time, the moisture in that fuel or in that grass out there will adjust to the humidity that's in the air. So what a lot of people don't think about is it could rain really hard this morning, sun come out and dry it out and humidity drops. And in a couple hours, we can burn that like lickety-split. I mean, it'll burn really well. So a lot of people don't think about that. And so that's why they're classified as 1-hour fuels. So we want a minimum of 1,500 pounds per acre of those fuels built up before we really recommend trying to burn to accomplish any kind of goal. So 1,500 pounds of fuel. How many pounds of fuel are right here in this pasture right here beside me?
4 to 5, 6 maybe.
4 to 5, 6,000 pounds? Okay.
I'm just looking at bales per acre.
There you go. A lot of people look at it that way. A lot of producers look at bales per acre. So if it's 1,500 pounds, you got maybe a bale an acre. So if you've got, I would agree, this is probably about 4,000 pounds, just as a rough. But just looking at it right then and there, you know, you can say, oh, we got plenty of fuel to burn right there. So it's moot point for exactly how much. We can clip all that and determine exactly how much, but for the purposes of burning, we got plenty of fuel. What about this behind Ken and us right here, this pasture? How many pounds of fuel are out there per acre? How many bales of hay per acre, round bales?
Maybe 1,000, 800,000.
Okay, 1,000? Yeah, probably that might be a little on the low side, but I would say that's probably 1,500 pounds, I'd say. I wouldn't mind burning that, except for one issue. What would that be? Is it contiguous? Fuel load? No, it's kind of spotty, isn't it? Which that may be a good thing, may be a bad thing, depending on my goals. So, but that would burn. That's enough fuel out there to burn. So, so these two places, we've got enough fuel. And of course, behind us here, behind you guys, that hasn't been burned in probably about since 2005. Ken and I were trying to think back, and so it's pretty much accumulated. So that's right. You made a good observation. It's got a lot of cedars in it. It's got a lot of brush encroachment in it. For the most part, there's some brush encroachment at this, but it's kind of being held at check. This has been burned every year for about the last 10 or 12 years. In this time of the year, in January, at this burn workshop, we set it aside for that. This gets burned right here. This was burned in July of 18, of this last growing season, and it gets burned about every 3 years, maybe 2 years, depending on kind of how this is configured and what we do at the burn workshops. But this is what we use for our growing season burn workshop. And so that was burned again July of this last growing season. This was burned in January a year ago. And so if you're a cow and you were turned loose in that gate up there and you've got access to this side, this pasture, no fences, where are you going to graze first? Right there. We got right here. Well, I got to see two this way, one this way, so anybody want to even up the odds? Okay, why would you want to, okay, a third one right there. Why would you want to graze right there if you're a cow?
Fresh grass, new grass.
Fresh new grass? That was burned in January a year ago.
Well, I mean,
This was burned in July.
after.
What's that?
You just turned it loose in the spring.
Okay, no, I'm sorry, I didn't specify a time frame. If you turned loose today, where would you graze? Over here? Okay, that made a difference then. Yeah, I would too. Why? Fresh. Yeah, a lot more fresh. It's probably not, you're probably not going to have the quality that a spring calving cow anyway, would need to meet her nutrient demands, but it'll be a lot higher and you'll have to feed a lot less, so it'll mean less money probably out of your pocketbook if they were grazing that versus this. So then if we take this one away, and now we have the choice between this and that, which one are they going to graze if they were turned out today? This one? 50-50. Oh, we got to split. Got a tiebreaker. This one. Why here?
It's newer. It has
Same
to
reason.
burn.
Exactly. Yeah. Good. Yeah. So we can look at therefore timing of burning with a livestock operation is pretty critical, and what a lot of people don't think about, or what a lot of people do, livestock producers think about burning now, between now and spring. And that's good, because between now and spring you can burn all that fuel off. It's basically like standing hay, pretty poor quality, but what you do then, you eliminate any kind of competition with what itself basically. And so you got, in the springtime, we get rain and things come along, you got nice green lush grass coming out that's very high quality, and cows don't have any, they don't have to work their way through all that dead standing decadent stuff. So that's going to be a good high quality forage source for them in the springtime. We can take that even further. Can we burn in mid-June for livestock?
You could.
Yeah, if we've got the, yeah, if we've got the fuel, yeah, percent of your place. And I'm talking, it's a good point, not talking your entire property, but just looking at patches of your place. You can burn again in June. You could burn again in August. And then you might burn again in October. If you burn in October, you might have some really high quality going into the dormant season, and some higher quality forages going back a ways in your rotational program. So you can extend the quality of your native forages by looking at burning at different times of the year, or you can make it an advantage burning one time of the year, whatever kind of fits your situation. So
just make a point. If you're doing what Russell is saying though, realize that what you're burning in the growing season is last year's growth, okay? So you're not burning the new growth. So if
Right.
you're burning in June, you're not burning this year's growth. You're not using that for fuel. You're using the fuel accumulated from the previous year as the ignition fuel.
Right.
So
So therefore,
Right.
stocking rate and carrying capacity will have to contribute to that because your green fuel isn't going to burn. You got to have enough of last year's growth in it.
to drive the moisture out to where it will burn.
Yeah. So that's theoretically though, what we're talking about works if your stocking rate. I mean, it's management. It takes a little bit of management and thought process and that kind of stuff. And it's something that you can't do every year too because we're going to have a drought or whatever. That'll maybe knock you out of being able to do that. So we looking at from a livestock standpoint, you want native. What we're talking about when entering fire or using fire is having a native plant community with your cows. And then another reason obviously is going to be increasing and improving the quality of the forage for your cows. And so we're addressing these because there's a lot of folks that think that you shouldn't burn if you've got cattle because you're burning up your grass. Well, we've talked about one very good reason is increasing forage quality. The other is if you don't burn, what happens? Cedars. What else? Mesquite. What else? I mean, does the cows eat cedars? No. Do they eat mesquite? A little bit of it maybe. Do they eat elm? Do they eat post oaks? Do they eat? I mean, all these woody plants start invasion. That's secondary plant succession happening at the best. So if you don't do anything with it, you don't disturb it with fire or whatever else, it's going to grow up into a woody plant community, and you're not going to have any forage for cattle. So you got to knock it back some way, and fire is a very economical way of doing that, especially if you get into a rotational burning system along with your grazing management. Yes, you can one-up me. You can say, well, I can go in there and nuke it with chemicals too and knock it back. Yep, you sure can. You can go in there with mechanical means and knock it back. Yep, you sure can. But you know what? Even with chemicals and mechanical methods and treatments, you leave it alone, what's going to happen? It's going to come back. So you're going to still be having to use chemical, and you're still going to be having to use some kind of mechanical deal, which is nothing wrong with those two, but those two are a lot more expensive than what fire might be. And sometimes you might have to use mechanical even on top of your fire, but fire can help you keep woody plants from encroaching too much and taking out too much of your forage. And the point we made to the last group, if you look over there under that big giant cedar tree, how much grass is under that? You know, and so not any. And you get a bunch of those, it doesn't take long for them to cover up an acre or 2 or 3 or 10 pretty quickly. This has been burned every year in January. We've raised the lower part of those woody plant canopies, those pecan tree canopies. There's pretty much grass growing right up to those tree trunks. So they're really not displacing a whole lot of grass. We're not worried about that. Plus, back to your, if you have, I'm only addressing livestock goals, but on this place we have wildlife goals, so we want a few of those woody plants out there. We want a few patches like this too, but not everything. Of course, cattle you're not going to have very many cows at all if you have something like what's behind us here. So, and then the other thing I wanted to make, I guess, is a lot of people think about grass and using fire for livestock operation, but if you have blocks of timber, wooded areas, those sometimes you can use fire. If you don't want to have to go in there and doze them or use chemicals or whatever, you can use fire over time. After repeated burning, you'll probably open the canopy up in those wooded areas and let more sunlight in. And if you let more sunlight in, you're going to get herbaceous plant growth. You're also going to top kill woody plants, and they're going to resprout. And so, contrary to popular belief, you turn cattle into a freshly burned wooded area, and they're going to eat a lot of those woody plants, especially greenbrier. So, and other plants. So you take that canopy of those trees down, you top kill them, and they resprout. And what I mean by top killing is you kill the plant material above the ground. Roots are still alive. They're going to resprout, and so then the forage, the leaves, all of that is going to be at a level where cattle and wildlife can reach it, and plus they're going to be a lot higher quality on that regrowth. So
when you say native range, are you talking about mostly grass, not forbs?
No, I'm talking forbs. Native range, yeah, you know, cows eat forbs too. Now I'm not talking a pasture full of western ragweed, but I'm talking about a pasture full of native grasses and native forbs of all kinds, which includes western ragweed. Yeah.
Depending on the timing of your burn, Doesn't some seasonal burns promote more grass?
Yes, that's it. Sure. If we were to burn this now, anytime between now and spring green up, you're probably going to favor grasses. If you burn later in the summer, say in August or September or October, there's research that shows that tends to increase the forb component in the plant community. So yeah, you can look at timing a burn to kind of shift temporarily the composition, but then if you leave it alone, it'll all go back to dominated by grasses in 2 or 3 years' time, depending on the amount of rainfall and where you are in the world. And then if you continue to leave it alone, depending on where you are in the world, it's going to go to a woody plant. It'll grow up, and if we don't do anything to this site we're standing on now, in 50 years, it's probably going to be a wooded area, heavily dominated by woody plants.
You'd probably be dominated by forbs.
Yeah.
Yep. Before it turned to woody.
Yeah, and that's the other thing I want to say. We can burn this, and what I work with producers, and if we burn this, I tell them to ignore it if they've got a rotational stocking program, or if they're stocked appropriately and continuously grazed, tell them to ignore it. Just burn it, and then of course they don't. There's the size of the patch and all that comes into play, but they don't need fences. They don't need. So many times you hear, if you burn this, and you need to let it rest for the whole growing season. Well, dang, that starts to get a little bit expensive, even if you're stocked lightly. Go in there and graze it. As long as you give it some rest during that growing season, it's fine. Even native grasses, you can burn it and come in there and it gets this tall and you can graze it and make it look like this, but then let it rest the rest of the growing season and you're gonna be fine. It's not the rest on the grasses after a big disturbance like that is key. So as long as you give it a little bit, you'll do fine. So it doesn't have to be rested after a fire.